For most of my adult life, I had always regarded the 19th century Unitarian minister Thomas Wentworth Higginson as a charming man of letters. He was also known, this was big in his day, he was also known for calisthenics. We don't use that term much anymore. We say there's a fitness nut or something, but back then they said he was into calisthenics. He spoke the usual progressive rhetoric of his time, falling unmistakably in the company of abolitionists and women suffragettes, exactly what we would hope for our Unitarian forebears to commit themselves to. In any superficial reading of Higginson, one would surmise that to a large extent he simply blended into the tapestry of transcendentalism with no distinguishing characteristics, unlike Emerson, Thoreau, Parker, Alcott, Fuller, Longfellow, and other obvious standouts. Instead, Higginson's claim to fame seems to rest on his privileged relationship with Emily Dickinson. It began when he published in 1860 an article in the Atlantic Monthly called A Letter to Young Contributors. He advised and encouraged young writers to step up. His words from the article, step up, submit your writings. And Emily Dickinson was 32 years old at the time, and she sent Higginson 4 of her poems, asking him if he felt her verse was alive. He offered her some criticism in return, described at the time as gentle surgery. And I think for all writers who are gathered here this morning, we can relate to that term, gentle surgery, for when we submit our writings and get some feedback. But Higginson asked her for additional poems. He eventually offered her high praise and gradually became her mentor and teacher, although the verdict in the literary world is that Emily Dickinson was probably already in a league of her own. Higginson urged her not to publish because he thought her unconventional form, punctuation, and style would not be well received by the public. But Higginson published volumes of her poetry posthumously, inserting his ideas of what ought to be the right and conventional punctuation. Sly fox. What is not widely known about this Unitarian minister from Worcester, Massachusetts, is that Thomas Wentworth Higginson's abolitionist sentiments rose far beyond the occasional sermon or verbal support that endorsed the entire transcendentalist anti-slavery position. He did distinguish himself during the Civil War, where from 1862 to 1864, Higginson served as colonel for the first federally organized black regiment. What is not widely known, however, is that prior to the war, 1858 and 1859, he met frequently with John Brown in efforts to assist Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. And this entailed an effort to capture weapons from a federal armory and lead a slave revolution throughout the South. Higginson was part of the notorious Secret Six. 6 white abolitionists who supplied Brown with money and support. 2 of the Secret Six were Unitarian ministers, Higginson and Theodore Parker. When the raid on Harper's Ferry failed, the 4 non-Unitarians comprising the Secret Six sort of vanished into the woodwork. And Theodore Parker was in Italy, recovering from tuberculosis at the home of Robert and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Only Higginson dared to publicly support Brown after Brown was convicted of treason and hanged on December 2nd, 1859. On the day of his execution, Brown wrote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be achieved." Surprisingly, Ralph Waldo Emerson, often accused of political indifference, spoke of John Brown as hero and martyr. So basically, when you think about it, we have three Unitarian heroes from the mid-19th century, Emerson, Parker, and Higginson, who were kind of, some more so than others, but were certainly in support of violence justified by their vision of a free society where no individual is reduced to a subhuman experience, that as a slave. Now, so the question I want to pose this morning is whether or not violence can ever be justified. Given our heightened sensibilities these days towards terrorism, which I think I can safely say we all abhor, we need to understand that the raid on Harper's Ferry was considered an act of terror. So what is terrorism, really? Using today's lingo, we could easily call the Secret Six a terrorist cell. So is this the equation? If violence supports our impassioned ideals, well, it's okay. If violence supports ideals antithetical to our own, then we condemn it. Emerson really struggled with the concept of political involvement. In 1841, he wrote his famous essay, Self-Reliance, in which he promotes the idea that we must swim against the tide of conformity. A self-reliant person ignores the disapproval of the world and follows his own genius. Emerson exhorts us to trust ourselves. That was his big pitch. Trust yourselves. The essay also condemns slavery, but Emerson recognized this condemnation as only a beginning. Condemning it really didn't do much. What troubled Emerson was how to take action against slavery. And it took him until 1860 to write an essay called Fate, contained in his book, The Conduct of Life. The essay Fate is essentially a reworking of his former essay, Self-Reliance. It's intriguing to note that Emerson refers now to John Brown as a model of self-reliance. That was big. In the essay Fate, Emerson finally recognizes the necessity to preserve a measure of self-reliance in a world that frustrates our will. The point being that our inner voice to act on behalf of justice and freedom gets harder and harder to distinguish in the din of a conformist world, content to just leave things alone. And so political engagement can easily become a moot point in a society content with the status quo. It's fate. This is where we are. It's fate. And yet, if we accept things as they are, we cannot possibly live our lives with integrity. The issues of the day, and Emerson made frequent reference to the times we live in, demand we fly in the face of conformity and disapproval. And this essay revisits again and again and again what these times require us to do. Is Emerson suggesting that violence can be justified by the times we live in? How do we interpret when he says, recognizing the necessity to preserve our understanding of truth against all conformity in a world that frustrates us? So what is expected of us in challenging times? How far do we pursue political engagement when a conformity of belief has established an untenable society? In his case, robbing people of their freedom. If John Brown is a model of self-reliance, then do we follow his example? The times leading up to the raid of Harper's Ferry revealed an America at its low point in making any commitment to justice. In 1851, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that African Americans, even those born free, were not U.S. citizens. This ruling made the Dred Scott decision 6 years later a very easy and simple matter. Dred Scott, if you remember, sued the government to attain his freedom. But the courts ruled that since he was not a citizen, he had no standing in the courts whatsoever. In 1860, the people of New York flocked to the polls in support of Abraham Lincoln. Fine. But these same people unconscionably voted down an initiative that would have eliminated the $250 property qualification imposed upon the black population only. So slavery and racism was not an issue confined to the South. In fact, Manhattan, the island of Manhattan, following the Revolutionary War, on that island we find that 40% of whites owned slaves, a higher percentage than we'd find in South Carolina. It wasn't until 1799 that New York voted for the gradual emancipation of slaves. And it took until 1827 for the last slaves in New York to be liberated. Going back to the earliest 1700s, 1741 to be exact, Caesar Varick was burned alive for plotting a slave revolt for slaves to rise up against their masters. Now I ask, was that terrorism? Was that what the time demanded? Did Varick realize the necessity to finally act in an otherwise frustrating world? Denmark Vesey, a black abolitionist, was executed in Charleston, South Carolina in 1822 for leading a failed slave rebellion. As a child, he was purchased by Joseph Vesey, who settled in Charleston. In 1799, Vesey, apparently a very big and bright slave, won $1,500 in a city lottery and used $600 of that money to purchase his freedom. But his wife's master refused to sell her to him. And Charleston whites continued to own her and own their children. By 1822, Vesey had begun to develop a plan for city slaves in Charleston to rise up and slay their masters as they slept, and then fight their way to the docks, set sail for the Republic of Haiti, where the slaves had successfully overthrown the French colonialists 20 years before. This is very controversial even today in Charleston, where some of the citizens want to memorialize Vesey with a statue right there in the city. City leaders have condemned the project. They have suggested, however, an alternative statue for an African American native to Charleston. their recommendation is the statue of Chubby Checker. Here again, we need to examine the word terrorist. There's no doubt that Vesey intended to murder a whole lot of white people. But don't those who condemn him, even today, realize, or I should say, don't they reveal how little we as a culture understand about slavery? And how slavery eliminated the very basic humanity of men and women who had neither any freedom, any rights at all. So when we place all of this into some common context, the slave revolts of Manhattan, led by Caesar Varick, to Denmark Vesey in Charleston, to radical Unitarian ministers like Parker and Higginson, who actually supported John Brown and his raid on Harper's Ferry. And Emerson's essays on self-reliance and fate, where he portrayed John Brown as a model of self-reliance. When we look at this, we put this all together, a climate of violence, either explicitly or implicitly, surrounds the issue of slavery in a world that frustrated bold people who were looking for meaningful change. Into this tapestry of rage among those who were oppressed and those whose conscience drove them to great fury, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. enters the world stage. In his first book, Stride Toward Freedom, King describes his pilgrimage to nonviolence. True pacifism, or nonviolent resistance, he wrote, is a courageous confrontation of evil by the power of love. He cited Gandhi's method of nonviolence as the most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom. King's first introduction to nonviolence was, incidentally, by way of another Unitarian transcendentalist, Henry David Thoreau, in his essay on civil disobedience. He read this as a freshman in college. King, who was raised in Atlanta and experienced a segregated society and the racism of Jim Crow, became intrigued by the idea of refusing to cooperate within an evil system. So all of us can probably imagine that nonviolence at first would constitute a fascinating intellectual concept just miles away from the actual experience of driving social change nonviolently. I mean, you say, yeah, that's an interesting concept, but going out and practicing nonviolence, they just seem light years apart. In 1955, at the start of the Montgomery bus boycott, King experienced the power of nonviolence for the very first time. And he also reacted to the bombing of his home with compassion. King understood that nonviolence was to become a way of life, or else it's ineffective. King furnished 6 key principles to nonviolence. 1, we can resist evil without resorting to violence. Number 1 principle, we can resist evil. 2, violence seeks to win the friendship and understanding of the opponent. 3, evil itself, not the people committing evil acts, evil itself should be opposed. 4, those committed to nonviolence must be willing to suffer without retaliation, as suffering itself can be redemptive. It's getting harder, isn't it? 5, nonviolent resistance avoids external physical violence and internal violence of the spirit as well. And finally, the nonviolent resistor must have a deep faith in the future, stemming from the conviction that the universe is always on the side of justice. Well, we know that many black citizens, like those in the Black Power movement, Black Panthers, Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X, they remain caught in this historic web, this historic pattern of bringing violence to bear as a tool for change. Now, Dr. King looked at these examples of violence, and he said, these reveal African Americans who had lost hope. They weren't wrong, they weren't bad. It's just a manifestation of what happens, in this case, African Americans who have lost hope. That's what they do, that's what they resort to. In his 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, he wrote, we maintain the hope while transforming the hate of traditional revolutions into positive, nonviolent power. As long as the hope was fulfilled, there was little questioning of nonviolence. But when the hopes were blasted, when people came to see that in spite of progress, their conditions were still insufferable, despair began to set in. Arguing that violent revolution was impractical in the context of a multiracial society, he concluded, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. The beauty of nonviolence is that in its own way and in its own time, it seeks to break the chain reaction of evil. In our present world, which certainly frustrates the fulfillment of justice, the inclination to use force prevails. And thus breaking the chain reaction of evil continues to elude us over and over again. And so we suffer, in fact, even more deeply. It is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., not John Brown, who serves as the model of self-reliance. King's political engagement sprung from a spiritual source so distant from what we normal, regular people experience. In times of oppression, when violence seems so necessary as a means to gain freedom, and we can even justify it as such, that beautiful, precious, invaluable voice, silenced 47 years ago, that voice can still be heard in our hearts, in our minds today. And it is the voice of nonviolence, the voice of hope, the voice of compassion, indeed, the voice of love.